Hey there, my name is Sarah. I'm a naturopathic doctor practicing in Toronto, Ontario. In today's video, I'm going to be answering the question, are naturopathic doctors against vaccines? To answer this question, I will discuss 4 points. Number 1, I'll talk about what I learned in Naturopathic Medical School about vaccinations. Number 2, I will tell you what registered naturopathic doctors in Canada are allowed to tell their patients about vaccinations. Number 3, I will go over a couple of studies that will explain how many naturopathic doctors in Canada are for or against vaccinations. And number 4, I'll talk about a paper that was recently released by the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine titled Improving Immunization Through Vaccine Administration by Regulated Naturopathic Doctors in Ontario. Timestamps will be listed down below in the description if you want to jump to a particular section, but I do recommend watching the whole entire video so you can be fully informed. I've always wanted to talk about vaccines, but have been very reluctant to do so because it's such a controversial topic. But here I am doing it anyways because we're in a global pandemic, right? And the new vaccines for this pandemic are soon to be available to the general public. And I think it's really important to set the record straight on where naturopathic doctors stand in regards to vaccines. Now, I feel the need to set the record straight on where naturopathic doctors stand because over the years I've met several people who have just assumed that I was against vaccines. And also over the years I have read very rude and flippant social media posts stating inaccurate things about naturopathic doctors, such as we're anti-vaxxers. And it's been a very long and slow process of having to message each individual person and explain why their posts are inaccurate. So I think making a video like this that lays all the facts out in one place will be better than having to go back and forth typing at personal messages. And you might think, oh, Sarah, just ignore those people. They're probably just uneducated people who don't know any better. No, in my experience, the people who have posted these inaccurate posts are very well educated. In fact, they're people that I met in university. That just goes to show that no matter how much education you have, how much or how little you have, you can still fall prey to misinformation. But when it comes to vaccines, it's very important to get accurate information. If people, especially well-educated people, continue to post inaccurate things saying a whole entire profession is against vaccinations, this might perpetuate vaccine hesitancy. For example, if a vaccine hesitant person were to read something that says medical doctors are for vaccinations and naturopathic doctors are against them, this might keep that person in their vaccine hesitant state. However, if they were to read something that says medical doctors and naturopathic doctors are on the same page in regards to vaccines, this might help them get more confidence in moving toward getting vaccinated, or at least might move them towards speaking to a professional about whether or not vaccination is right for them. So please, if you see someone posting or making a comment saying that naturopathic doctors are against vaccines, please send them this video. I hope that it sets the record straight. Let me get to point number 1. What did I learn in Naturopathic Medical School? Before I begin, I do want to make a small disclaimer. I want to say that this section of the video is based on my personal experience. I attended the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, so I'm going to talk about what I was taught there. I haven't attended any of the other schools that are accredited in North America, so I can't speak to what was taught at those schools. Secondly, I want to say that I attended Naturopathic Med School between the years 2014 and 2017. And I think this is relevant information because the naturopathic profession has changed a lot in just the past 10 years. Just like conventional medicine, naturopathic medicine is always growing, it's always improving. With that being said, the vaccine rules and regulations that I'll talk about later on in the video were written between the years 2014 and 2019. So that means that naturopathic graduates who graduated before 2014 could have very well been taught something else about vaccines. And that's simply because there were no rules and regulations about what could be taught until 2014 came around. But rest assured, even if those graduates did learn something completely different back in school, if they are still in practice today, they still need to abide by the current vaccine rules and regulations that I, again, will talk about later in the video. So what was I taught? Well, let me start off by saying that in school, I was never taught to discourage people from taking vaccines. And I was never taught that there are natural alternatives to vaccines. And also, I was never taught that vaccines cause autism. And to add to this, I want to say that I have never been taught to tell people to stop taking their prescription medications, come to the dark side, and go all natural. Despite what many people think, that is not what I was taught to do. So what did I learn about vaccines? Well, in general, for all the treatments that I learned about, I had to learn 5 key things about each treatment. Number 1, I need to know the potential risks of treatment. I need to know what are the side effects associated with the treatment, or whether or not there are some contraindications with that treatment. Number 2, I had to learn the potential benefits of a treatment. What is the dose that's required for therapeutic benefit? How long must you take a treatment to see a difference? What are the potential benefits? Number 3, I need to know the costs of treatment. Not just how much it is going to be financially, but also the costs of time. Does a patient have to take time off of work to come into the office once a week to get something done? Or is it something that you just take home, do it yourself, and that's it? Number 4, I need to know if there are alternatives to treatment or if there are not alternatives to treatment. And number 5, I need to know the indications for the treatment. What is it for? What's the reason for giving this treatment? So when it came to learning about vaccines, I needed to know those 5 things. I also learned other things like there are different types of vaccines. Also, I learned the general process of how vaccines and pharmaceuticals are made to be safe and efficacious. They need to go through a really long application and clinical trial process to become approved to give to patients. So that's a small summary of what I learned about vaccines. It's pretty standard information that most healthcare providers need to know. Now, despite knowing all this information about vaccines, are naturopathic doctors even allowed to communicate this knowledge to patients? This brings me to my second point. What are registered naturopathic doctors allowed to say to their patients about vaccines? To me, this is the most important part of the video. But before I get into it, I want to go over the definitions of 2 terms. Scope of practice describes the procedures, actions, and processes that a healthcare practitioner is permitted to undertake in keeping with the terms of their professional license. The scope of practice is limited to that which the law allows for specific education and experience and specific demonstrated competency. Each jurisdiction has laws, licensing bodies, and regulations that describe requirements for education and training and define scope of practice. Now, in a nutshell, what that means is if something is in your scope of practice, you're allowed to do it. If it is outside your scope of practice, you're not allowed to do it. Term number 2, regulatory colleges. Health regulatory colleges are responsible for ensuring that regulated health professionals provide health services in a safe, professional, and ethical manner. This includes, among other things, setting standards of practice for the profession and investigating complaints about members of the profession and, where appropriate, disciplining them. So regulatory colleges keep the professionals in their college in line. In Canada, there are 10 provinces and 3 territories. Naturopathic doctors are regulated in just 5 provinces: British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. Here is a list of the regulatory bodies that regulate naturopathic doctors in each of those provinces. And I'm telling you about these regulatory bodies because they are the organizations that determine the scope of practice and standards of practice for naturopathic doctors. They are the ones that determine what a naturopathic doctor can and cannot do, and also how to do something. So when it comes to vaccines, they determine what naturopathic doctors are allowed to say to their patients. So right now I'm going to show you each document that explains the standards of care that is expected in each of those 5 provinces as of February 20th, 2021. You can pause the video to read each one if you'd like, but I'll explain what all of them say in a nutshell. They all basically say that prescribing and administering vaccines is outside the scope of practice for naturopathic doctors. So that means if a patient were to come in and ask me, "Hey Sarah, what do you think about vaccines? Should I get them?" My job is to say, "Sorry, it's outside my scope of practice. I'm not allowed to give you any advice about vaccines. What you need to do is go speak to your family doctor and find out if they are right for you or not." These documents also say that there are no known natural alternatives to vaccine. So if a patient asks me, "Hey Sarah, are there any other alternatives to vaccines, or are there natural vaccines available?" It's my job to say, no, there are no known alternatives to vaccines. Vaccines are the only things that can do what they do. And finally, in these documents, they say that naturopathic doctors are not allowed to withhold treatment and care from a patient who has exercised their right to choose not to get vaccinated. That means whether a patient has decided to get a vaccine or has decided not to get a vaccine, it will not negatively or positively impact the doctor-patient relationship between the patient and their naturopath. So that means if one of my patients tells me that they have decided not to get a vaccine, I cannot kick them out of my clinic. I cannot dismiss them from my practice. So by showing you these standards of practice, I hope that you can see that naturopathic doctors are not against vaccines. It's pretty clear in the documentation that we are not allowed to communicate anti-vaccine messages. But at the same time, naturopathic doctors aren't allowed to be overtly pro-vaccine because vaccines are outside our scope of practice. We're supposed to be neutral. We aren't allowed to communicate anything about vaccines, even if the stuff that we say aligns with the CDC or the PHAC recommendations. What we're allowed to do is just say, go speak to your medical doctor about it, and that's it. By the way, you might be wondering, what about the other 5 provinces and 3 territories that are not regulated? What are naturopathic professionals allowed to say there? Well, technically, they're allowed to say whatever the heck they want. And that's because there are no regulatory bodies in those areas. If there's no regulatory body there, there are no standards and rules and regulations to follow. And without those, then there's nothing that says something is correct or incorrect to say. And this is why it's so important that these areas of Canada make naturopathic doctors a regulated profession so that those professionals in those areas can be held accountable for whenever they say misinformation. Alright, so that covers what naturopathic doctors are allowed to say to their patients. So if a registered naturopathic doctor wants to keep their doctor title and privilege to practice, they need to follow those regulations. But do all naturopathic doctors follow the rules? This brings me to part 3. So let's go over 2 studies that will show just how many naturopathic doctors are not following the rules. I came across this first study from a National Post article a couple years ago when 2 of my university acquaintances posted it onto their Facebook wall. Apparently it was enough proof for them to believe that naturopathic doctors are all anti-vaxxers. But if you were to critically appraise the article, you would probably come to a different conclusion. Now, this 2017 article isn't entirely devoted to talking about naturopathic doctors and vaccines, but it does touch on the topic that naturopathic doctors are against vaccine. In the article, a former naturopathic doctor named Britt Hermes made the claim that in her pediatrics course at Bastyr University, she was taught a whole bunch of anti-vaccine propaganda. Now, I don't know if that claim is true or not, but seeing as Hermes went to Naturopathic Medical School between 2007 and 2011 and was probably taught by naturopathic doctors who were educated before her time, it's not too surprising that she could have been taught information that was deemed appropriate at that time, but today is now deemed inappropriate and inaccurate. Especially if you consider that for 12 years, between the years of 1998 and 2010, there was a large fear and suspicion that the MMR vaccine was responsible for causing autism and colitis in children. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, there was a British medical doctor named Andrew Wakefield who published a study in 1998 stating that there was an association between the MMR vaccine and autism and colitis in children. This study was published in the Lancet in 1998, but wasn't fully deemed fraudulent and wasn't fully retracted from the Lancet until February 2010. Now, in February 2010, Britt Hermes was probably in the last part of her third year and about to enter her fourth year of internship, where there are no classes that you take during fourth year. You only see patients during that time. So in the 3 years before 2010, in her classes, she could have very well been taught to be hesitant around vaccines or maybe even against them, because of that study that wasn't debunked until 2010. But regardless of this pretty relevant information, the words of Britt Hermes, a 2011 graduate, is now in a 2017 National Post article to make it sound like anti-vaccine propaganda is being taught in classes right now, when in reality it's not. At least in my experience, it wasn't. But to support this claim, the author of the National Post article, Sharon Kirkley, cited this 2017 article headed by Timothy Caulfield, who is a professor of law at the University of Alberta. And I don't really know why she used Caulfield's article, because it doesn't really support the argument that naturopathic doctors are full of anti-vaccine propaganda. But she uses it anyways, and let me tell you, she tries to mislead readers into believing the proportion of naturopathic doctors who communicate anti-vaccine messages is larger than it really is. You see, in her article, she writes 330 naturopath websites analyzed, 40 included vaccine hesitancy discourse, and 26 offered vaccine or flu shot alternatives. Now, from this sentence, it looks like 66 out of 330 websites, 18%, were found to have anti-vaccine rhetoric. But if you actually read the original Caulfield article, it states this, that in total, 53 had either vaccine hesitant language, suggested a vaccine alternative, or had both. So only 53 of the 333 websites, 16% of the websites were found to have anti-vaccine rhetoric, not the 18% that Kirkley was trying to covertly suggest. But regardless of it being 16% or 18%, I don't see how this supports Britt Hermes' claim that pediatrics courses are full of anti-vaccine propaganda. 16% is hardly a majority. Even Timothy Caulfield states this in his article, saying, quote, "To be fair, the number of naturopathic websites with explicitly anti-vaccination rhetoric was relatively small, 53 out of 330. So I'm not sure how people are being led to believe that this whole profession is against vaccines when only 16% of websites indicate anti-vaccine rhetoric. But let's look at Caulfield's article a little bit more. It states this. So this wasn't even a fully comprehensive analysis to begin with. The actual percentage could be more than 16%, but then it could also be less than 16%. We won't know until an actual comprehensive analysis is done. And I tried looking for one and stumbled across this August 2020 research article. If you want to read this 20-page paper yourself, you can. I'll link it down below. But to summarize it, it's a study that looked at the websites of CAM organizations, Canadian Chiropractic, Naturopathic, and Homeopathic organizations, to see what kind of vaccine-related information was being pushed to their members. Afterward, the study looked into peer-reviewed literature pieces written by individual practitioners from each CAM organization. For the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on the naturopathic portion of this paper and not spend much time on the chiropractic and homeopathic findings in this paper. So for the naturopathic organizations, there were 18 naturopathic web pages that were reviewed, and 13 of those 18 websites said nothing about vaccines. So the remaining 5 websites had these statements and directives. And for the sake of time, again, I'm only going to post them here for you to pause and read if you want to. There's only one of the 18 web pages that expressed some concerns about vaccines, and it was an editorial released by the Ontario Association of Naturopathic Doctors called 10 Healthy Brain Tips. This editorial implied that vaccines are a common source of mercury, which results in brain disease. Now, I tried to find the editorial and read it myself to see if it did imply this message, but I looked on the OAND website and couldn't find the editorial, so I don't know if it really implied that or not. The study then continues on and reviewed 65 peer-reviewed articles to see what was being communicated about vaccines. Of the 65 articles, over half were from specialized homeopathic journals, and 26% was from chiropractic journals, and the rest were from various other sections. Nearly half of the articles were published in 2010 or after 2010. 46.2% was published between 2000 and 2009, and 7.7% was published before 2000. Since it doesn't explicitly say what portion of the articles were written by a naturopathic author, it's a little tough to determine where naturopathic authors stand in regards to vaccines. This section of the article was primarily dedicated to focusing on the chiropractic and homeopathic professions. But I will say that if you read the 12 example excerpts from these homeopathic and chiropractic journals, you'll find that 2 were kind of vaccine hesitant, 4 were pro-vaccine, and 6 of them had explicitly negative opinions on vaccines, and 4 of those negative opinions were written before 2010. But again, it shouldn't be surprising that negative viewpoints were held before 2010, as I mentioned before. Anyhow, in the discussion section of this article, it states this, and I want to focus on the last sentence here, and it says, "The CAM literature cannot be described in broad strokes as either pro or anti-vaccination without considering finer areas of disagreement." And this conclusion makes sense because overall, homeopaths, chiropractors, and naturopathic doctors have vaccines outside their scope of practice. It makes sense to see that we are neither pro or anti-vaccination. Now, there is the argument that we could be vaccine neutral superficially on our websites, but then in secret we're discussing the safety of vaccines and whether to take them or not in our own private practice or within paywalled academic journals. But I think the same could be said about all healthcare professionals. I mean, despite being an overtly pro-vaccine profession, medical doctors aren't all pro-vaccine. Some medical doctors are not. There have been documented events of medical doctors writing unnecessary vaccine exemptions for children. In California, the number of medical exemptions went up so high in 2015 that a new law was enacted to abolish non-medical exemptions. But even though the law was passed, A small number of physicians still sold medical exemptions, wrote large numbers of them, and did a lot of damage. There were ads online, and lists of doctors selling exemptions were passed around by anti-vaccine parents in social media groups. Newspapers reported some schools had medical exemption rates of 10% to 50%. Anything above 5% is implausible. There simply aren't that many people with true medical contraindications to vaccines. Apparently, writing medical exemptions is profitable. Some medical doctors could get $300 or $500 per exemption. There was even a Sacramento doctor who charged $97 for a webinar called From Corners to Confident: How to Safely Navigate California's Vaccine Mandate Law. In this webinar, parents were taught how to ask for medical exemptions for my child if I want one. Now, after reading about these unethical medical doctors, it would be unfair for me to make the generalization that all medical doctors are unethical. Most of the time, people give the whole profession the benefit of the doubt and just assume that the unethical doctors are a small batch of bad apples in a huge orchard of good ethical apples. But when it comes to naturopathic doctors, in my opinion, I feel like we are not given the same benefit of the doubt. Because when one naturopathic doctor messes up, the actions of that one person really has a huge impact on the reputation of the entire profession. I think this double standard is unfair and very frustrating. It's unfair that one former naturopathic doctor who graduated in 2011 gets to determine how naturopathic doctors of today are being represented. It's unfair that 16% of 330 websites in Caulfield's study are misleading society to think that we are a profession of anti-vaxxers. Now, of course, you could say that this small minority of naturopathic doctors are responsible for fueling vaccine hesitancy. Yes, it's true. However, I don't think that this small number of naturopathic doctors is responsible for all of vaccine hesitancy. There are a lot of other contributors to it. If you take a look at this 2020 study done in Spain, after 5,200 people were interviewed, results showed that CAM is not necessarily a major obstacle to people's willingness to vaccinate, and that the more proximal obstacle is people's mistrust of conventional medicine. So I hope it is very, very clear that only a small minority of naturopathic doctors are against vaccines. Most naturopathic doctors hold a neutral position on vaccines. But I will say there is one silver lining that comes with the inaccurate generalization that naturopathic doctors are against vaccines. And that is, we are in a great position to influence the movable middle, the vaccine hesitant. This brings me to my final point. I want to go over this paper that was released to CCNM alumni in October last year. It's a paper that was co-authored by the President and CEO of the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, Bob Bernhardt. It's a paper that was sent to the Ontario government, which proposes that naturopathic doctors should be given the option to get certified in administering vaccines. This was proposed so that there would be an increase in the number of healthcare providers who can give the vaccine to patients. And it will also allow patients who are a little bit fearful and nervous about vaccines to speak to a practitioner that they trust. The paper provides these 6 reasons for why this should occur. Pause the video if you want to read them all, or view the document via the link in the description. I personally think this is a great idea, especially since we are in a global pandemic. In my 2.5 years of practice, no patient has ever asked me my position on vaccines. It just never happened. It wasn't until December last year, when 2 of the new vaccines became approved, did patients begin to ask me my own thoughts about the vaccine. 3 patients asked me my position on the vaccines, and expressed that they were hesitant to get the vaccines and wanted my recommendation on whether to get it or not. But of course, like a good naturopathic doctor, I said that it was outside my scope of practice and that they would need to speak to their family doctor to see if it was right for them. In response, one of them said that they have already tried speaking to their family doctor and it didn't go so well. She felt like her concerns were brushed off. And the other two didn't bother wanting to talk to their family doctor because they already knew what they would say. They would probably say, yes, go get it done. So they wanted to talk to me about my thoughts because the naturopathic position on vaccines isn't really clear or known, so they were curious to find out what I had to say. It seems like vaccine hesitant people are not interested in talking to their family doctors because their answers are going to be predictable and just kind of cookie cutter. But with naturopathic doctors, since our stance is kind of unknown, the curiosity of what our stance is what brings up vaccine into the conversation. So I had 3 opportunities to talk to 3 vaccine hesitant patients and try to build their confidence. But since I'm a naturopathic doctor, I can't, because they're not in my scope of practice. But if it was in my scope of practice, I know that I have the willingness to sit and listen and understand each patient's concern. I know that my appointments are fairly long, from 30 minutes to 60 minutes, so I know I have the time that I can give to each patient to have an in-depth conversation, and I know I have the patience to wait for each patient to organically grow more confident in getting a vaccine. Because in my opinion, forcing a patient to do something or dismissing them and kicking them out of your clinic does not build trust or rapport. Anyhow, I haven't heard any updates on whether the Ontario government will allow this proposal to pass, so as of now, vaccines are still outside the scope of naturopathic doctors' practice. But I hope this paper shows that naturopathic doctors want to be part of the solution to this pandemic. We want to contribute our part. We don't want this pandemic to keep on going on and on. If there's something that we could do to help, we are here ready to do it. So long story short, are naturopathic doctors against vaccines? The answer is no. There are very clear rules and regulations that state naturopathic doctors cannot communicate anti-vaccine messages. At the same time, naturopathic doctors aren't allowed to be overtly pro-vaccine because vaccines are outside our scope of practice. For now, a naturopathic doctor can only just say, please go see your family doctor and talk about vaccines with them. And this will have to continue happening until we ourselves are given the privilege to talk about vaccines with our patients. Now, you may run into a naturopathic doctor that does communicate anti-vaccine messages, but please know that's just a minority of the whole profession. That person may be in a non-regulated area of Canada, or if they are in a regulated area, they might not be registered to practice. And if they are registered in a regulated area, that doctor is just going against the current rules and regulations on vaccines. But those kind of doctors are in the minority, not the majority. Most naturopathic doctors hold a neutral position when it comes to vaccines. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. If you took the time to watch it all the way to the end, I want to say I appreciate you so much. To all my new subscribers, welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for hitting subscribe. And hello again to my old subscribers. Thank you for sticking around. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you ever meet someone who thinks naturopathic doctors are anti-vaxxers, please send this video to them. There are more videos like this to come, so hit subscribe if you're interested. If not, I'll see you when I see you. Okay, thank you again for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.